Check it out. Yesterday, I practiced for 4 hours to go through a 7-step process that I normally take my students through in 1 month. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to go from not knowing a jazz standard at all to being able to improvise over it on a fairly high level. Let's do this thing. What's up, Brent here from LearnJazzStandards.com, which is a blog, a podcast, videos, and a membership geared towards helping you become a better jazz musician. Now, if you're like many of my students who first come to me in my LJS Inner Circle membership and feel like I can't play great solos, melodic, creative solos over jazz standards, and I just don't know where to start, this video is for you, and I'm going to help you really go from 0 to 100. So let's go ahead and start with that first step, number 1. Phase 1 is we're going to learn the melody and the chord changes of the jazz standard. Now, in my Inner Circle membership, we're studying In a Mellow Tone by Duke Ellington this month, so I'm going to use that tune as an example for today's video. Now, of course, this seems like an obvious first step. Of course, you have to learn the melody and the chord changes. However, think about it this way. The melody is something that you can use in your solos, so you want to know it really well, and the chord changes are what we're improvising over, so you want to know them forwards and backwards. So I spent a good deal of time just working through the melody and the chord changes, and here is what I came up with. Now, you may be thinking, hold on, Brent, 1 second, you're going way too fast. How do I even learn a jazz standard, especially by ear, which is what I recommend? Well, for the purpose of this video, I'm not going to go deep into this process, but essentially I use my list process: listen, internalize, sing, and then transfer. And at the end of this video, I'm going to link to a really helpful resource that will really help you and give you this exact process and framework to work through. So stick with me to the end on that one. Now, if you're not a guitar player or a piano player and you're a horn player or trumpet player, saxophone player, then feel free just to work on the chord changes by playing the arpeggios of the 7th chords and making sure you know where they fit in the time. Now that we have that phase done, let's move on to start really digging deep into what notes we can use over this jazz standard. Phase 2 is we're going to build a chord tone map. Now, this is the step in the process where we're going to start at the very basics of discovering what notes we can play over this jazz standard. And for me, every single time, the first place to start is the chord tones. Those chord tones, the roots, the thirds, the fifths, and the sevenths, are the essential notes that we need to start mapping out to figure out how to navigate over them with a jazz standard. And what I do when I create these chord tone maps is I like to use what I call voice leading, meaning I play up one set of chord changes, root, third, fifth, seventh, and then down the next chord, I connect it to the nearest chord tone. Now, the magic of this is that means that you're not always starting on the root of every single chord. Sometimes you're connecting from the 7th of the next chord, or the root, or the third. You might be starting on a weird note that you're not used to, and this really makes sure that you actually know the chord tones and where they fit on your instrument. And more importantly, you're going to start hearing very deeply the sounds of these chord tones as you go over it. So after I was done practicing it, I committed it to memory, and here's me playing through a chord tone map of In a Mellow Tone. obviously I was working from an existing chord tone map that was created for my inner circle members, but you can also create your own as long as you understand the concept that we're going for here, ascending and descending chord tones, connecting them together with voice leading, and you're going to be in good hands. But the most important part of this is to commit it to memory. Don't just read it off a piece of sheet music. You can read it off a piece of sheet music and then memorize it, or you can actually learn it by ear if you have a recording of an existing chord tone map, or again, you can create your own. But the important thing is committing it to memory. Let's move on to phase number 3. In phase number 3, we're going to work on a guide tone map. Now, in case you don't know what guide tones are, those are the thirds and the sevenths of each chord. And the reason why we want to start mapping those out is because when we really look at the different qualities of seventh chords and jazz standards, major, minor, dominant, half diminished, and fully diminished sevenths, the difference between all of them that changes from each chord to each chord is the thirds and the sevenths. So we want to be resolving our lines more often than not to these chord tones. So we want to identify them on our instruments, but more importantly, start really internalizing the sounds of them. So with our guide tone map, it's the very same concept. We're going to go up the guide tones of one chord and then down the next, connecting them with voice leading, the nearest guide tone. Now, the cool thing about jazz standards is if they are moving in fourths, like a 2-5-1 chord progression, then that means that the third, or rather the seventh, is always going to be resolving to the third. Doesn't always work out that way, so just use voice leading by stepwise motion to connect them together. So I practiced a guide tone map, committed it to memory, and here's what I came up with. Now, in this step of the process, I was really starting to internalize these sounds very strongly of what the important chord tones were. Like, I really started to feel connected to this tune in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise if I didn't start going through this process. And again, you can create your own if you'd like, or use an existing one that's been provided for you. But the most important part is to commit it to memory. It opens up that side of the brain that we're really looking for to build on our improvisation. With that being done, let's move on to phase number 4. Now, phase number 4 is where things get a little bit more intense. And to be honest with you, this took me the longest to learn and memorize out of all of the things that I'm going to go over today in this 7-step process. And that is, we're going to create a scale map. Now, notice how scales is the last thing I'm doing as far as the mapping, because really I think of scales as simply just the notes in between the chord tones. They're really not the main focus here. They're just all the notes in between. Now, when creating your scale tone map, it's the very exact same thing as the chord tone map and the guide tone map. Same concept of voice leading and going up and down, connecting to the nearest one. But I just pick really basic scales. For the sake of in a mellow tone, I'm just using Mixolydian for dominant 7th chords, Dorian minor for minor 7th chords, the major scale for major 7th chords, and the whole half diminished scale for the diminished chords. I do throw in one altered scale for one of the dominant 7th chords just to add a little bit of flavor, but in general, I recommend keeping it really, really simple. Now, after I went through this process, I felt this entirely new connection to the chord changes of this tune. The really difficult thing was that really the scales were all blurring together because I was starting and ending on completely different notes other than the root. It really forced me to truly understand what the difference between each scale was, even if it was just one note. So I can't even hardly explain it to you what actually happens, the transformation when you go through this process, but really like almost just opens up this area of your brain that you didn't know could be opened up. So this was incredibly powerful to work through this scale map after going through the chord tones and the guide tones. Now, these last three steps are what I call mapping phases. They have nothing to do with music. They have everything to do with the technicalities of playing the stuff on your instrument and opening up your ears to the different note choices you may have. But with all that being said, now it's time to go into the more musical portion of these 7 steps. And now let's move into phase 5. Phase 5, we're going to start learning jazz language. Now, when I think about learning jazz language over a jazz standard, I highly recommend learning one chorus of a jazz solo by ear on that jazz standard you're working on, in this case in a mellow tone, or using an etude, just one chorus, not more than that. You could even do half a chorus, which is what I do here. I just learned half a chorus of this etude that we had composed for us for our inner circle members, and then I go and I take that information. But we need to learn jazz language to get a sense of what kind of musical ideas can we play over this? What kind of inspiration can we draw for our later steps that we're actually going to go through? All right. So I learned this etude and learned a bunch of jazz language. And after I memorized it, put it to practice, here's what it sounded like. Now, listening to that etude, that first half chorus, you probably realized like, wow, there's a lot of really awesome bebop lines and cool chromaticism and even some great rhythmic ideas in there. And now I know these things, right? I committed it to memory and it just opened up the floodgates. Like, sure, there's the chord tones and the guide tones and all that stuff in there, but this was actual music. And now I just learned some actual language to play over it. Now, this is really powerful stuff. So I always would suggest going through this process of learning language. However, it's not near as important as this next step, step number 6, that we're about to go through, that really opens up the doors for creativity. Phase number 6 is I'm going to compose my own solo over top of in a mellow tone. Now, this part is really important, creating something of your own, because yes, it's helpful to learn someone else's stuff in their own language, but the stuff that you actually write yourself is much more likely to come out organically in your improvisation. And by composing and slowing the improvisation process down, we can really start to understand the stuff that we actually would want to play and internalize those ideas. Now, the key here is I'm actually going to be using concepts and ideas that I learned from the etude, as well as all the mapping exercises. And it doesn't have to be perfect. And after spending a little bit of time, I decided to compose the second half of in a mellow tone, since I learned the first half of the etude, and this is what I came up with. Now, you may have noticed I stole a few ideas from the etude I learned. I stole some, quarter note triplet ideas there. I stole at the very end an altered lick that literally came exactly from that etude I learned. So I tried to take what I had learned and applied it for myself over the tune. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, Brent, I don't think I could write that good of a solo or play that good of a solo. Don't worry about that. Like, you just have to start doing it. And the more you do this stuff, the better and better you'll get, the more language you'll learn, the more you'll learn how to translate it for yourself. Finally, we move on to phase number 7, the last step, which is where we actually just practice improvising. Because at the end of the day, we have to just step out there and just start taking risks and trying things and messing around. So I would recommend spending quite a bit of time just improvising over the tune. Given all the amazing stuff you just learned, you're essentially set up for max success here, and you'll have some tools ready to go to start improvising. So just start practicing improvising. Now, on purpose, I decided I'd only do a couple of takes of my improv, and this is what I came up with. Now, even though I practiced everything I would normally have my students do in 1 month in only 4 hours, even just after these 4 hours, I just felt like I was completely encompassed by this tune. Like, I knew it so well, and I couldn't even imagine, like, what if I had actually properly done this over the course of a month? Like, I would really feel incredibly confident in this jazz standard. So I want to challenge you to take this 7-step process and apply it over a jazz standard yourself. Of course, by the way, if you ever want to join my LGS Inner Circle membership, we literally learn a new jazz standard every single month. I'll leave a link in the description down below. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I have a really cool handout called the list process for learning jazz standards by ear, and that's linked right up here. And I would highly encourage you to check that out to get my exact framework for doing that. And if you got lost into the music theory at any point in time, here's some essential music theory, this video that will really help you out in case chord tones, guide tones, and all that went way over your head. Make sure you like this video if you found it useful, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Hope to see you in some future videos.